Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Richard Kerr, the founder of North Borneo Historical Society. Thank you for participating in this evening's program, where we'll be talking about a very uh, interesting topic that is close to my heart. It's about liberation of Borneo. So today we have two esteemed speakers. Oh, actually, they're historian and writers as well. They have done an extensive research about the Sabah's history, and then they'll be sharing some of their thoughts and opinion, and even some of the things that they have done the research before. So just a bit of background. North Borneo Historical Society started in 2010, whereby it's a digital society to promote the history of Sabah. Because back then, when I before I started the historical society, I had a huge problem where I couldn't find available resources to check about Sabah's history, and I decided to start it my own, and then started to created a few social media pages, and then those pages become a place where we start sharing some of the bits and pieces of Sabah's history. So fast forward to today, I believe we have spurred a lot of interest, sparked a lot of interest among the members, not just locally, but of course globally as well, to take part and to be part of the Sabah's interesting history. So, all right, so without further ado, I would like to invite two of our visitors or guests for tonight. First of all, we have Shari, and secondly, we have Mr. Aman Avtar Singh. So we're gonna get them to introduce themselves. Okay, Mr. Shari, do you want to start first?
Okay, thank you, Richard, for giving us this opportunity to talk about the liberation of Borneo. Let me introduce a bit about my background. I'm a banker for 30 over years, but don't know, I'm a history enthusiast and history buff also. So basically, I'm doing a lot of private research on North Borneo history, particularly on 200 years of documented evidence of agreement signed by the British and all the parties involved in North Borneo. So that is unpublished book. As far as written research is the history of Sembulan. Okay, so tonight I would like to share about the schedule of events in North Borneo World War II. But before we go further, I hand it over to Mr. Aman Avtar, who actually an expert in World War II. He talked exclusively, extensively about Midway battle, and two of us actually did a presentation about this history, this topic, somewhere in 2019. So over to you, Mr. Aman.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Aman. My background is actually I was originally a businessman. I'm semi-retired, and I spent the last number of years actually researching and publishing books on World War II. I've published 3 books. The first was the Indian Legion in the German Army, the Waffen-SS during the Second World War. I have 2 other books. One is on the Battle of Midway, and another on a tank destroyer that fought in the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Much of my background is actually in the Eastern Front. Much of my research is on the Eastern Front in Europe, the Second World War. I have a great interest because my original thesis, which I did about 20 years ago, is actually on the Battle of Midway. I'm currently pursuing, unfortunately because of COVID-19, a postgraduate certificate in historical studies with Oxford University. So this is a very slow process now. And also just finished a course in First World War perspectives, and the next one I'm doing is actually on Nazi Germany. So yeah, quite extensive. So yeah, there's a lot to share. lot to discuss about as far as Borneo and World War II history. So over to you guys.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
also want to thank Richard, also who actually founded North Borneo Historical Society. I was lucky enough to be invited into the Sejarah Sabah North Borneo by Mr. Lim Kok. Somewhere a few years ago. My role is more or less like going through the history that been shared in Facebook. My role is to make sure that the history share is accurate, and then we do a lot of cross reference to make sure that only through an accurate history shared via Facebook. This is part of our continuing effort to be a responsible responsible into shares of historical information. Of course, I'm also a blogger on history subject for the last 10 years. So doing this extensively. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for the introduction. So, as you know, World War II has always been a very interesting subject. I mean, if you watch all the books available about World War II, all the amazing Hollywood movies about World War II, it's just that there's always something missing, that we still haven't, watched anything that is related to Sabah, or probably it's very on a small scale. What if one day we can create something Hollywood grade or something like that is related to Sabah's World War II history? So I guess there's always a start to something amazing. So without further ado, so we're gonna jump off straight to the topic about tonight is about the liberation of Borneo. So we will split this discussion tonight. We'll do a bit of an introduction about what happened first, why did the the invasion of the Japanese took place, and then of course we're gonna slightly talk about what happened during the Japanese invasion, and then eventually we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about the liberation itself, because yesterday I discovered through a friend from my hometown in Tawau, to a friend, he discovered an archive from the US whereby it has this huge collection of the World War II history. Basically, it was a footage and photographs taken by those who were involved in recording the military footages during the war. So I found some of the interesting footage, which we'll show tonight, and also some of the interesting photos. So I'm going to start off real quick. I'm going to show this to begin about setting the context right about during the first Japanese invasion. So probably Avtar, do you want to just start off telling us about this picture? What does it tell, and how everything began?
This is interesting. This is the first time I actually saw this image was tonight, just before this talk. So this is a Japanese, I think it was about 300 Japanese soldiers arriving from Brunei. At the jetty in Labuan, you can see the Harrison Crossfield building there in the background. What we know is the Japanese arrived just before dark, so this would have been maybe 5 p.m., 5:30, 6 p.m., because they captured the resident of Labuan, A.H. Humphrey, at about 7:30 p.m. at his residence just outside of town. So yeah, significant photo. First time I'm seeing it actually. So yeah.
So
this would have been on Thursday, the 1st of January, 1942.
So the first of January 1942 is the official date of the invasion of Borneo. It's all started captured Labuan. Yeah. Actually, it started on 16 December 1941. The Japanese forces landed at Miri, Sarawak, and then which is 8 days after the attack of Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
Very interesting. So perhaps either one of you gentlemen, you want to just probably share a bit what was the main or the key motivation for the Japanese to invade Borneo, or for in this context would be North Borneo.
Oil, primarily oil. First of all, the oil fields in Brunei, Syria, Kuala Belait, and of course Miri. Oil would have been the primary reason for capturing Brunei first. Brunei gets captured first, along with Miri. Labuan comes subsequently afterwards. It's a vital port. And of course, Labuan in 1941 is actually not a major military outpost or base. It is merely a transit point for seaplanes plying the route between Hong Kong and Singapore. So Labuan will be a refueling stop. So in Labuan, you have also a cable station, which relays cable messages between Hong Kong, North Borneo, and Singapore, as well as a seaplane fuel depot for fuel. The fuel depot is actually destroyed just before the Japanese land in Labuan by the resident of Labuan, Humphrey. Not sure particularly when it's destroyed, whether it's on the same day the Japanese land in Labuan, or is it destroyed a few days before?
So based on my reading, actually, I don't know so much about history. I just created this platform for everyone. But based on my reading, the Japanese had already started some, activities. Even before the war, they had established a business in North Borneo. Even in Tawau, they have created a lot of the companies there have Japanese origin. And based on some of my readings, some of these Japanese actually did some, spying activities. They were, observing what are the activities on the ground, so giving those strategic information to the military in Japan. Can you, Shari or Avtar, do you want to comment on that?
Actually, this is a very interesting question because I look at the numbers of Japanese army in both Sarawak, Sabah, and Tarakan in Indonesia. The total number of the army is about 35,000 people. But again, if you look at it, only 17,000 combatants, The rest of them are actually Japanese civilians. So when we talk about Japanese civilian, meaning there are traders, farmers, those people are involved in previous activities. They are conscripted into the Japanese army, So can you imagine that they have been with us for a very long time? They know exactly and what's going on, the exact location. They know everybody who are actually a strong supporter of the even allied forces, the British or the Brooke, So yeah, they are the one who actually giving away a lot of information, the key members of the society.
The Japanese, actually, if we look at the contribution of the Japanese society in Sabah, it goes back easily, I would say, 150 years. We're going back to the 1800s. The Japanese are in Sandakan. They are mainly in the fishing industry. They're also traders. So Japanese involvement in North Borneo goes back a fair amount of time. I would not put it past, that there were Japanese spies. Yes, we know they were. We know for a fact there were Japanese spies in Malaya. There was also a British officer who was a Japanese spy who was sharing vital military information with the Japanese as well. Eventually, he was captured in Penang after the invasion of Malaya, and he was taken back to Singapore for trial. And just before the fall of Singapore, they actually disposed of him. They actually tied him at, I can't remember the name of the port in Singapore. I should know it. Anyways, near Sentosa Island. And they just basically chucked him off the side of the pier and let him drown. So, yeah. But spying was, I think in any combat, any conflict, spying would be a norm, I think, for most forces.
To add about that, they also conscripted the Kampetai, mostly Formosan, from Taiwan, to be, to be part of the army. And then, of course, they conscripted local people and Javanese. That is in the case of Tarakan. So, meaning, when they landed, they also promoted this agenda, Asia for Asians, so they actually earlier on managed to actually confuse the people of supporting them, But of course, things turn to a very difficult or different directions after several events going on in Sabah.
I see. Okay, so we've touched a bit on the why did the invasion happen. Of course, there's a lot of topics that we can talk about, and we can probably schedule that for another episode. But probably briefly amongst you two, what happened during the war itself, during that duration? I know we have, I've noticed the North Borneo had its own currency, and then some of the Japanese banks, they established their branch in North Borneo as well, like one of the pictures that I'm about to show. But you guys can just probably give a bit of comments or your thoughts on that.
The chartered company in Labuan immediately burned all the chartered companies' currencies, in Labuan. We do not know why they do that, but of course, when the Japanese came, the Japanese forced the people to actually use the Japanese new currency equal value to the chartered company's currency, so that's actually what actually happened.
Just to bring up 2 points. Richard, earlier you mentioned, I think Shari also mentioned the introduction of Formosan or Taiwanese soldiers and also Koreans as well into North Borneo and also Sarawak. The primary problem once we get to 1943, 1944, the Japanese simply don't have the manpower to be able to administer and also guard these locations, because they're fighting so many battles in the South Pacific, not only setting defensive posts, but also fighting it out in Papua New Guinea and Guadalcanal, and they're losing manpower by the hundreds on a daily basis. They have no choice. They have to conscript these soldiers from Taiwan and Korea. And on the second point, when the Japanese land in Labuan, it's obvious by April 1942, they make a lot of promises to the community leaders, the Indian and the Chinese communities and the Malay communities in Labuan, for example, where they promise allowances to be paid to government administrators, police, and so forth to carry on administrating the island, for example. It's the same in Brunei as well. And what happens is they start having a shortage of imported foods and also foods to sell. Businesses, local grocery shops are having problems supplying. And it's obvious by April 1942, the Japanese are not keeping their promises. And you start having a lot of misguided loyalties, and people who think that may be in their best interest to cooperate with the Japanese find it's not in their best interest.
Yeah, that's interesting that you brought up the strategic Japanese army movement. In actual fact, when they put 30,000 army in Borneo, that's it, You all have to survive, meaning you have to protect this Borneo and you die all the way. It's like the Battle of Iwo Jima. They are entrenched there, They will position their people and then they want to defend. That's the setback of the Japanese at the end of the day. They lose the power of the naval and air, which is very important component in war. So when they lose the power of sea and air, that's it. So they're just waiting for the invasion back of the Allied forces into Borneo.
Right. So I just want to touch a bit on this photo. I just want to thank you, Mr. Nicholas Tan, who has been instrumental in collecting a lot of the old photos of Sabah. And these photos are actually featured in one of the books that they published a couple of years ago. Either you, Shari, or Avtar, do you know anything? Do you want to comment about this photo here and the location?
Yeah, well, I can't comment on the location, but what I can tell you is that basically what happens is with Borneo is the Japanese essentially split Borneo into provinces as what they have in Japan. So you have 2 provinces in North Borneo. You have the Western North Borneo and the Eastern North Borneo provinces. So Western North Borneo is Shiganshu province, and then you have Toganshu province on the East Coast. So basically, Api-Api, Beaufort, Kota Belud, Kota Marudu, Keningau, Western, and Labuan are considered the West. Elopura, which is the original name for Sandakan, it's changed under the Japanese Elopura. Baluran, Ladatu, and Tawau is Togunchu, which is the eastern side. And what happens is within each province, the Japanese appoint a provincial governor or administrator for each province, and sometimes they leave much of the administration under the hands of local administrators, natives, not Westerners, not colonial administrators, but locals. But under Japanese surveillance, including the Kempeitai, the Japanese secret police or intelligence, and each province basically is a prefecture. So basically, by 1942, once North Borneo and Sarawak are essentially under Japanese occupation and rule, and the Japanese are confident there's no more resistance, much of the British territories are assigned and secured, under what is a Kawaguchi detachment, a very small Japanese detachment. So the capital of the Japanese administration is actually moved from Miri to Kuching. And eventually, Jesselton also becomes, or Apiapi becomes another center of administration for the Japanese.
The decision by the Central Command by the time it was not to engage the Japanese army, you see. So meaning when they landed in Labuan, they simply just landed with no forces, you see. So meaning they decided not to engage the Japanese. Again, Avtar, I think you were mentioning about Labuan also. They changed the name of Labuan to General Maida, is it?
Yeah, General Maida was actually appointed head basically for Borneo. He was based in Kuching, so he moved the Japanese headquarters from Miri to Kuching for a short period of time. He's actually in command of Borneo for a very short period of time. I think it was from March to September. He's killed in a plane crash during a flight from Kuching to visit the new airbase, the new airstrip the Japanese have built on Labuan Island. So there's a plane crash. He's killed, and Labuan is named after him. Labuan ends up being called Maida Island for a short period of time as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned after just about the they split Borneo into several provinces. I guess this is the map, although we couldn't zoom into this now, but you can roughly see all the different provinces within Borneo itself. If you look at Kalimantan, they actually split them quite well into all these different regions, and Sarawak itself it's pretty much like one big area. But in Borneo, North Borneo, if you look at it, it's like 7 or 8 provinces.
MacArthur promised.
Sorry, Shari, if I could add, the British and the Dutch were not really prepared for war. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Malaya began, the British only really had 1 battalion of soldiers in Sarawak, not even in North Borneo or Labuan. It was a 2nd battalion of the 15th Punjab Regiment, which only had a strength of about 1,000 men. They probably had an artillery or gun battery unit. They may have an engineering unit as well. They were dependent also on the Sarawak Rangers, which may be numbered at the most 1,500 men. It wasn't really a large force in Borneo. Brunei, I think they had a Punjab detachment there as well, which again, they couldn't really do much. You had almost 30,000 Japanese soldiers invading North Borneo and Sarawak, Brunei, and you just merely had about 1,000, 1,500, Indian soldiers defending. Impossible.
Yeah, they cannot defend North Borneo.
Okay, so it's pretty obvious that during the war itself, there's a lot of campaigns that are happening around the region, especially in the Pacific Theater. A lot of action going on there. So for this Borneo campaign, which the process of liberating Borneo from the Japanese started in 1945. It is mentioned that it is the last major Allied campaign in the Southwest Pacific area during World War II to liberate, British Borneo and Dutch Borneo. So I guess since we have already touched a bit on why the invasion started, and then we touch a bit on during the war itself, and now we're going to jump off straight to the topic for tonight, which is the liberation of Borneo. This topic, there'll be a lot of things that we can talk about, but of course tonight, since it's only just the first round, we're just going to do a bit of high level and just to understand about the story itself. So I'm going to start off real quick showing a video that or footage that was that I discovered just last night, which can be really interesting, and it's actually showing the bombing mission in Jesselton. Okay, just give me 1 second.
24 B-24s flew from Morotai to Jesselton, terminus of Borneo's only rail line on the northwest coast, on December 17th. The liberators were given P-38 cover, and rendezvous was made about an hour before reaching the target. Expected enemy interception produced only 3 Jap fighters, all of which were shot down. The target, the Jap air base at Jesselton, was effectively bombed. This field, thought to be a Jap staging area, has 2 runways which were to be destroyed. Bombing from 10,000 feet, the Libs claimed 15 enemy planes destroyed on the ground, bearing out the previous report of snooper planes that Jap air activity had been observed at this field.
Wow, how amazing is that? So as you can see, that was actually the site of the current Kota Kinabalu International Airport near Tanjung Aru. And this is actually one of the rarest footage that I've seen. In fact, there's another photo that has actually accompanies the mission itself. We're going to share with you real quick. So, all right, Shari, do you want to start? Give a bit of background on why the bombing mission was performed.
Well, that's interesting. They're actually from Morotai all the way to the west coast here in North Borneo. And that footage just now actually is in Tanjung Aru, the airport. And this is part of their campaign to bombard Japanese position at the coastal area, a prelude to the invasion of Borneo. So they did this, either by bombing, strafing, and they kill both the Japanese and the local alike. I think Avtar have some comment about this bombing and strafing activity.
Well, the bombing campaign starts towards the end of 1944, progresses into 1945. So what you have is, for the most part, you have long-range American bombers targeting infrastructure, ports, harbors, fuel depots, runways and airfields, and railway lines. But the problem is, these bombing campaigns continue where we have total destruction of Sandakan, Jesselton, Labuan, Kudat, and Tawau as well. And unfortunately, it involved the loss of quite a considerable number of locals as well, who unfortunately were caught in these bombing raids. We know that POWs at Sandakan airfield who were building the airfield, maintaining the airfield, were also unfortunately killed during some of these bombing campaigns as well. Morotai is a major staging point in the invasion of the Philippines and eventually Borneo for the Australians and especially the Americans. So much of the 4 or 5 airfields that are built in Morotai. So you have the Americans who have the vast majority of fighters and bombers in Morotai. You also have a large contingent of Royal Australian Air Force aircraft as well, medium and heavy bombers as well as fighters. And it's only really after the Australians take Tarakan that you find the bombing campaign intensifies with low-level strafing and attacks on Brunei and Labuan and the other towns as well around North Borneo. That photo is interesting because if you look at the date, it's actually 10th July 1945. So you can actually sort of see there's sort of a fire going on, and I presume that's the railway station, the current railway station in Jesselton. And you can see where Tanjung Aru Beach Hotel would be. There's sort of like a tip there in the corner. And you can see in the far right corner, it looks to be the current Jesselton or Kota Kinabalu Airport. And you'll notice the liberators are now flying in a northerly direction because by now, by July 1945, the Americans have established air bases in the Philippines. So the bombers are no longer coming from Morotai, but they're coming from the Philippines up north now.
Earlier on, we talk about oil and rubber, of which the main reason why they occupy Borneo. Just want to tell you, the Japanese only able to use the oil for 1 year, which is 1943. After 1943, perhaps after the Battle of Midway, they lose air superiority. So meaning 1944 onward, they doesn't have air cover, the Japanese. So basically, the Allied forces just proceed with bombing and try to weaken the Japanese forces on the ground. So the liberation of Borneo actually started somewhere in May in 1945. This is the plan. This is the approved plan, which is June and July 1945. But in actual fact, the earlier plan was in 1st of April 1945. That is the actual date when they actually wanted to come back and liberate Borneo. So they started with Tarakan first, and that is the biggest deployment of troops in Tarakan. They deploy about 30,000 troop Allied forces in Tarakan alone, and then in North Borneo over this side, you see there are three group which is landed on the 10th, which is they go to Muara, they go to Labuan. This is stated on the 10th. So this thing actually in elite group, I look at this group, they call it the 9th Division. They're the heroes. They call themselves the Red of Tobruk. And then they're hero of the war in 1941-42 at Tobruk and El Amin and New Guinea in 1943. Overall, the battle in Tarakan, there is about 900 Australian casualty, including 225 killed. From this onward, 10 of June, there is in Labuan, for example, there is a defensive force of the Japanese, but that was easily covered by the landing force on the 10th of June. So actually, in order for them to capture Tarakan, it just took them about 2 to 3 weeks. But again, for them to occupy Tarakan, it took them a few months, So this heavy defensive also play by the Japanese in the eastern coast. But as far as the west coast, a lot of things happened long before the invasion. We believe by a lot of those group, the recognition group, the Z Force, they did a lot of damages, so much so the troop have no choice. They have to go into the interior, especially Sabong, to make the last stand over that side,
Right.
So the liberation on Brunei Bay is on the 10th to 16th of June, and then. Overall, I look because they said the Australian troops, they sent an elite force. The number of casualty actually way less than 1,000 people. I mean, overall, in terms of recapturing back Borneo, in comparison to the Japanese troop, I looked at number just now, more than quite substantial numbers of Japanese killed. I think more than 10,000. Japanese killed in the defense of Borneo against the incoming invasion of the Allied forces.
Okay, so the invasion, as far as I know, they came in from multiple places. Of course, we mentioned it just now about Tarakan. Balikpapan also is actually one of the main battle arenas, and of course we have Labuan. Labuan is one of the entry points, and Labuan actually became a place where a lot of the military activities took place once it became a sort of like a the airport where all the military aircrafts landed and everything. And I believe we have some photos to show on that too. Avtar, what do you think about the during the operations when they started to liberate North Borneo? What do you think about the overall operations? Do you think it was a success, or do you think it's just it's just trying to decoy whatever happening on the ground?
Well, I think first of all we have to remember that the 9th Division was made up of a very experienced bunch of soldiers who had fought the desert campaign in North Africa against Rommel, against the Germans, and they won. They did really well against the Germans for almost 2.5 years. So they were recalled back to Australia around about October 1942, at a time when the Germans were losing on the Eastern Front. The Germans were doing extremely badly in the Eastern Front. They had just about lost an entire army at Stalingrad. The Germans could no longer divert resources to North Africa. The Americans had just entered North Africa as well. So 9th Division were pulled out of North Africa, brought back to Australia. They were basically given almost 8 months of rest. Manpower was replaced. They were back up to full strength by August 1943, and by September 1943, they were already involved in the invasion of Leh, and then subsequently, they were used for the invasion of Tarakan and Balikpapan successfully. They were probably the very best the Australians had in the Pacific at that time. Now, the other thing we also need to take into account is that the Australians had, based on a little bit of inspiration from what the British had been doing for a number of years, Special Operations Australia, or SOA, was founded in March 1942 in Australia, and was modeled sort of after the British Special Operations Executive, we call it, or SOE. And their task was to conduct guerrilla warfare, intelligence gathering, and also to build a network of spies and agents against enemy forces, including to conduct sabotage operations. So in 1943, it became known as the SRD, or Services Reconnaissance Department. And these ISD raiding commando units were designated as Z Special Unit, or Z Force that we like to call them today. So, you have them between 1943 and 1945 in North Borneo, conducting surveillance on Japanese shipping, especially along the Sulu Sea, going up north into the Philippines. Very active area for Japanese forces. The Japanese know the Americans are coming. They know that MacArthur is coming to reclaim the Philippines. So the Japanese make almost a last stand in the Philippines. If you look at the number of Japanese forces that are put in the Philippines, the number of Japanese fighters and aircraft that are moved into the Philippines by 1944, mid to late 1944, and you see the number of losses the Japanese are suffering on a daily basis, the number of aircraft and pilots that they're losing, Borneo becomes irrelevant to them, and you find the number of aircraft defending North Borneo drops significantly. In one instance, I think that video that you showed, the Japanese were only able to send up 3 fighters against 24 Liberator bombers on that bombing mission. Only 3. What does that tell you? They just don't have the aircraft anymore. Everything's been diverted to the defense of Philippines and the home islands, Okinawa, Saipan, and so forth. The Japanese, the last group of Japanese fighters that they have in number are actually in Singapore. And those fighters are moved to Tarakan and Balikpapan to defend, because they know the oil fields in Tarakan and Balikpapan are going to be a target for the invasion. And those are eventually also destroyed as well, just prior to the invasion of Tarakan and Balikpapan. So, yeah, it's one of those things. And the other thing, just to point out, Shari brought up a very important point earlier, was that the Japanese were basically making a last stand. The Japanese made 2 last stands in North Borneo. One was actually not in Jesselton or Sedakan. It was actually in Sapong, near Tadam. For some reason, they decided they were going to make a last stand in the middle of North Borneo, in Sapong near Tenam. And of course, you have the other group that is retreating with the allied prisoners from Sandakan towards Ranau, and so they're planning to make a last stand in Ranau as well. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add some more. Come back to the previous map about the OBO operation, OBO 1, OBO 2. Actually, there are 6 operations was forwarded to General MacArthur. OBO 1, OBO 2, OBO 3, OBO 4, OBO 5, OBO 6. But only 3 operation was approved by General MacArthur. One is to Tarakan, one is Balikpapan, and OBO 6 is going to the West Coast, which is 3 area, 1 go, which is at Muara, Brunei, and Labuan, single day attack on the 10th of June, 1945. So that also look how they actually finally decided what is the best approach on the landing. It's not like the big D-Day landing like what we saw in the movie in the in the Europe. But this landing in Labuan also involved quite a significant number of army movement. It's about another 30,000 people there.
Correct. Yeah, I've seen some of the footage, which is very interesting. They came in large ships.
That's a really graphic photo. I mean, it tells you quite a fair bit about the bombing operations in North Borneo. This is Sandakan, I presume, right?
This is Sandakan,
The harbor's getting bombed. You can see the Sandakan field is still there. So you've got the right corner, you've got a Mitchell medium bomber there that's swerving a little bit. So I presume this photograph is taken from the rear gunner's position looking back. But dramatic photo. Yeah.
One interesting thing that I need to point about this OBO operation. This is signify the Australian willingness. They demonstrate Australian willingness to deploy large armed forces in Southeast Asia. So that's the last you see they came over Southeast Asia with the large operations. So this is something memorable. This is something that a lot of them sacrifice their lives in North Borneo to liberate us.
Shari, it's a good point you bring up about sacrifice. I'd like to mention 2 very important names that that need to be mentioned. I think one is Albert Kwok. Dr. Danny Wong has a really good book about the Kwok Rebellion that occurred in North Borneo, which I think everybody should read. And the second person that I should mention who was part of Z-Force SRD was a gentleman called Gord Chester, who actually lived in North Borneo for 20 years before the start of the war. He had a plantation in Lokawi. He happened to be in Australia at the start of the war, so he was not in North Borneo at that time. He joined Z-Force, and he was part of the commando operations on the East Coast and eventually on the West Coast of North Borneo as well. He unfortunately died a year after the war in Jesselton from, I think it was black fever or malaria, and he's buried here in Kota Kinabalu as well. A decorated officer, Rochester.
Another thing I can add when you talk about World War II in Sabah, there are 2 important, interesting part that we need to share as well, probably perhaps in the next session, which is the death march, of which very gruesome, very horrifying, and very horrendous.
Definitely. We actually we did a small coverage last year around this time, or around May or June last year. We still have the video published on our YouTube channel. Probably we can have a look later after this and see how we can talk more about that, the Sandakan Death March. In fact, there was at one point in time there was some talks about a movie going to be created based off the Sandakan Death March, which is going to be really
When you talk about movie, Richard, I'm also at this point of time, with the help of so many history buff historian in Sabah, compiling local hero. We actually already compiled more than 1,000 names of heroes, local heroes, apart from 2,000 of which the Australian and the British POWs that suffered
Yeah.
during the death march. We also compile a long list of 1,000 names. Hopefully one day our state government can allow us to put a wall and put all these names. We call it
Yes, with
honor.
tribute. Yes, with tribute to them.
We call it heroes roll,
Mm-hmm.
of which we can put the name of all our unsung heroes, those heroes that actually contribute and suffered great tragedy
Yeah.
in order to help liberations of North Borneo. So I
Yeah.
think this is an ongoing project that I'm doing.
Excellent.
Hopefully, that one day we can see
Mm-hmm.
all their name. This can validate the contribution and the sacrifice of some people's fathers, grandfathers
Right.
into helping into liberation of North Borneo.
Okay. So we mentioned just now about the scale of the liberation when the Allied forces, especially the Australian forces, entered from Labuan. So this is actually one example of the crafts that they use, and I think when they landed, it was largely unopposed, although there were a lot of snipers here and there. And then this was the huge battalion that came in. Even before they reached the island, I remember the battleships were bombarding the island quite extensively before they reached the shore. Okay,
Much of
so
the Japanese defense during the invasion of Labuan was centered on defending the airfield. It was a pointless defense, but that was their strategy at the time, was just to hold up for as long as they could. Areas around the northern and western side of the airfield. So there was some combat. I think the Australians over the Borneo campaign lost about 114 men, I think. The Japanese, of course, significantly larger numbers of losses. But yeah, that was I think the bloodiest campaign for the Australians was the taking of the airfield at Labuan.
Right. So one of the places that the landing place was also a place called Weston, right? Do you guys have information or share about this picture? This picture was actually taken at Weston during the part of the liberation process.
Yeah, the landing at Weston was largely unopposed. Not really a problem for the Australians at that time. The real opposition they had was actually further up north at Beaufort, which I believe lasted for about 2 days. And before the Japanese were eventually pushed further up north, they began their retreat towards Papar. So you have some combat up at Papar. And of course, by that time, we're into August and the surrender of Japan on the 15th of August, 1945, with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs in Japan. And for the most part, I think combat comes to an end around there, and Jesselton is taken relatively peacefully at that time.
I want to read some numbers here. The Japanese strength in British Borneo by 31st October 1945, there was about 21,000 Japanese troops in British Borneo. In Jesselton alone, the troops number is about 6,600. In Papar, 2,300. In Beaufort, about 187 Japanese troops. In Papan Island of Labuan, 1,200 Japanese troops. In Kuching, 2,832 Japanese troops. Bao near Kuching, 3,292. In transit from Lido, 200 Japanese troops. In Trusan River, about 346. This is the number that I mentioned earlier, Richard. Actually, the army itself, either the navy or the infantry, there's only total about 25,000, and there are about 99,000 civilian. And the total number of the Japanese army by October 1945 is about 35,386. When we come back into the liberation again, let me read the numbers of army movement. For example, the OBO 1, the Allied Forces troop, which is from 1st of May to 20 1st of June is about 15,532 troops against Japanese, which is 2,200. And then the Japanese killed in action is about 1,006 against Allied forces killed in action 251. I try to read as fast as possible. Almost 6. The strength of the Allied forces about 30,000 from 10th of June to 15th of August. Estimate Japanese army during the time is about 8,800. Killed in action Japanese about 1,002. And Allied forces casualties about 114. That is killed in action. I haven't mentioned wounded in action. Over 2, which is from 1st to 21st of July, 33,000 troops were deployed. And the Japanese army during that time is only 5,000. So there's no way the Japanese can actually defend Borneo with the size of troops that's coming in to liberate Borneo.
Okay.
Do we know which airfield it is?
Shari was the one sharing this today. Do you want to give a bit of a context on this photograph?
Looks like Jesselton.
Yeah, this is thank you to Mr. Nicholas Tan again, who are sharing this photo in Ross Ibbotson book about the founding of railway in Jesselton. We found this, which is to complement the video footage. The video footage is actually this one. That is the bombing of the Tanjung Aru. This is somewhere near Batu Tiga, which is near Tanjung. You can see Pulau Gaya behind it.
Yeah, very clear the background.
Yeah. You can see a lot of coconut trees by the swampy area over this side. Yeah.
Is that a road? Or, can you see, Shari? Is that the railway track that's running on the southern end of the airfield?
It looked like a railway track, And actually, my family actually stay somewhere here in Jesselton. Right before all this bombing, they all already run to Kinarut. They stay in somewhere in Kinarut. Based on the reading that I read, actually before the invasion of the Japanese and after during the liberation of Borneo, a lot of those people in Jesselton actually already start moving out from Jesselton. They stay in in the orchard, in the farm, somewhere in Putatan, Mangatal, Telipok. They are not staying somewhere near to the coastal center. People always thought that when the Japanese came, they will attack Jesselton first. But in actual fact, that's the other way around, like what you mentioned. They attack west. They actually go to Miri, then go to Labuan, then go upward. Like what Aman said earlier on. From Labuan go to west. So that's the interesting part. That's a very beautiful footage. Nicholas Tan is very famous of having this sort of collection. These are envy of every people in Sabah.
Okay, so I think we have roughly about 5 minutes left. I'm going to open the floor to the audience today. So we have quite a number of people joining us live tonight on talking about the liberation of Borneo. So this is going to be the first topic for at least for the next few weeks. We're going to deep dive a couple of more topics related to the liberation itself. I think a lot of things happening, as you know, Shari and Avtar already mentioned a couple of things that are happening during the liberation itself. So I'm going to open up the floor to any questions. You guys can just leave your comments on this at your screen. If you have any specific question that you want to ask either Shari or Avtar about the liberation of Borneo itself. I'm just waiting for the comments.
Chris Hartley, I think he was saying that his father, John Frederick Hartley, was an Australian soldier of Chinese descent and was a member of Z Force, Samut 2 and 3 in Sarawak. Well, that's interesting. We, of course, are trying to find more members of Z Force who actually were in the Samut operations of the. So that's fantastic. It's good to see that you're following us as well. So nice to meet you, Chris.
Yeah, I think we would encourage people, if you guys have any information that you want to provide related to to the discussion tonight, please drop us a message. You can just send us a message through this Facebook page, or feel free to reach out to any one of us. We can be reached on Facebook as well. We have another comment here. Let me just go down real quick. All right.
So Jude, Gus, you're talking about Tom Harrison. Interesting character. I think Shari and me were actually talking about him recently, and I absolutely love his writing. I love his work, and he's done some absolutely crucial work for the Sarawak archives, the Sarawak Museum as well after the war. Him and his wife. There's another really good book as well. Judith's book, The Airmen and the Headhunters, is a great book. The other book, of course, is by Tom himself, called The World Within, which you can actually get in Kota Kinabalu at the bookshop in Merdeka. So if you want to know a little bit about special operations behind enemy lines, working with native headhunters against Japanese forces, and World Within will give you a really good insight into what actually happened towards the end of the war in North Borneo, and how there were two headhunting expeditions that were carried out in 1945. One was with Samot in Barrio with the Kalabet headhunters, chasing the Japanese who were retreating from Miri across the Crocker Range Mountains back into Spitang. And of course, the second headhunting expedition was by the Muruts in Tenamu, who headhunted the Japanese who were retreating from Sapong, trying to get to Jesselton. Datuk Danny Wong actually shared with me many years ago that he had discovered where the Japanese commander was complaining to the Australians about the Muruts headhunting them during this retreat. So taking history to share and discover.
All right, thank you for that. So we have a question here: why Allied bombers bombed Tanjung Aru? So I guess we know the obvious reason, but of course we would love to hear from either one.
Avtar, I think this for you. I think
Okay,
they're targeting the this is the airfield. So they're targeting this area where actually they try to create damages for the Japanese defender to inflict against the incoming Allied forces invasion.
Basically, to make sure that the airfields were not operational, couldn't be used by Japanese aircraft, and of course, to knock out any Japanese aircraft that happened to be there. So, this is a low-level bombing operation. You can see it's maybe about 1,000 feet above, maybe less, above the airfield. So, low-level bombing mission.
Okay, I think we have one more question that we can take before we conclude for the night. Avtar, you mentioned there were some fighting between Allied forces and the Japanese somewhere near Beaufort. Is there any details of the engagement, and do we know which units were involved?
It was a very short engagement over 2 days and nights, where the Australians were trying to cross the Padas River. The Japanese were on the opposite bank. The Australians, of course, arrived from Western, so they would have been on the western bank of the Padas River. So Japanese were on the eastern bank, which is where the current old town of Beaufort is. So extensive combat over 2 days. And there's actually a memorial near the district office, the Beaufort district office, for an Australian soldier that was killed in combat. If you happen to go or happen to be from Beaufort, there is a memorial there, Stipovich Memorial. But this engagement was short, 2 days, and then the Japanese retreated up north with Avtar.
Okay.
If we were to talk about liberation of Borneo, there are actually a lot of pockets of interesting topic that we can talk about. Again, in 45 minutes, we cannot cover all the interesting topic. But again, allow me to read some of this letter by Paul Ham, just for the viewer tonight.
You have 30 seconds, Shari. You have 30 seconds.
This book given by David Porter to me. Actually, there are 50 million people died in Second World War. More than half were Asian people, Allied service women, the victim of Japanese aggression. So what we're trying to say here is we don't hate the Japanese. We are tolerate this. Is it over?
No, still around.
So what we're trying to say here is, we cannot just forever hate Japanese over this matter. I also did some research that they actually were forced to, do whatever atrocity that they have to do here in North Borneo. They are just like, army, where they have to follow instructions. Of course, they cannot solve, they cannot cover the damages they have done, the killing of our people, those who actually involved, those something that very cruel. So
Yeah.
anyway,
So, right.
that's the message that I want to say.
Richard,
Yep.
just
Yes.
one thing to add. Gus, the other book that you talk about, Judith's other book, I think it's The Most Offending Soul Alive or something like that. I think that was about Tom Harrison. That's a really good book as well. I say Tom is a very interesting character, not the most likable of people, but he got the job done. Eccentric in his own way. So
I followed Tom Harrison from the very beginning when he actually started in special force and into his work in anthropology, and until he passed away in Thailand in an accident. So actually, I followed Tom Harrison pretty much on whatever he did in Borneo.
So, okay, before we end for the night, I think we're overshot about 2 minutes. We're just going to show this this sort of like a disturbing image. This is actually the landing in Balikpapan. The damage was very extensive as well. I think I can't remember how many troops were there or were deployed during this invasion by the Allied. So this is just sort of like a reminder that we're gonna jump into more interesting topics in the next few episodes. So Shari and Avtar, we will be cracking our heads during the next few days, plan to plan. Perhaps we can arrange one for the next weekend, yeah?
Yeah.
more than happy.
All right then. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time for joining us tonight. I know the session is a bit short, just 1 hour, but hopefully we can do more smaller episodes that we can distribute for the next few weeks. And thank you again for joining North Borneo Historical Society. Signing out and good night.
Good night,
everyone.
Good night.